I totally get the fear. You've got all of these people who depend on you, their livelihoods, their families. Often you're close to them. You care about them. You've got shareholders. You've got billions of dollars in capital. You've got all this stuff. And all you've got in front of you is somebody talking what sounds like nonsensical idealism. And you have no idea how to translate that into reality, even if you might believe in the underlying philosophy. And so that, and you get really scared that if I don't deal with this quickly, this is going to turn into something that's going to undermine me completely and end up killing me. And I totally get that. I totally get that fear. And the only way through that is help build a new change in thinking, build some practical transition measures and practical ways of doing it that reflects this new way of thinking, and work with those folks who are doing it because they know best on how they can change, and they have incredibly useful input and advice in the process. Anything in life that's worthwhile, you always have to dance with the devil.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode is with Garry Merkel. I've had Garry on in the past twice, actually, now. The first time was talking about old growth. The second time was talking about reconciliation and Indigenous land ethics. And this time around, we are going more specific. I wanted to have Garry on again because the last time I had him on, we talked a lot philosophically about stuff, but didn't really get into the details about what this looks like and how we could achieve it. So I wanted to bring him on again to talk about Indigenous land ethics, to talk about traditional knowledge and what Indigenous forestry looks like. And so if you don't know Garry, he is highly respected in the forestry community in BC as well as Alberta. He is a registered professional forester. He's a member of Tahltan First Nations. He's been involved in First Nations governance for 3 decades. I can't even begin to list the number of policies and forums and groups and planning committees and stuff that he's been a part of, because he's just been a part of everything. So he's very well known, and he knows his stuff when it comes to First Nations issues. And I wanted to have him on again just to get into the nitty gritty about what Aboriginal forestry looks like and provide some examples and give us some context. Garry's awesome. He does such a good job of really investing himself in every perspective and really understanding kind of where people are coming from and trying to empathize with their position. And this conversation is all about the future. He doesn't want anyone to walk away from this conversation feeling guilty or feeling attacked or anything like that. This is just a conversation amongst two people talking about ideas that are interesting. And he just wants to see the future be better than the past. And I think everyone can agree with that. And so with that, sponsors for this episode, West Fraser is the number one for 2022. They've been with me since the beginning. I cannot thank them enough for their support. They allow me to do this the way I want to do it. Thanks, West Fraser. And secondly, Greenlink Forestry. They've been with me since the beginning as well, and I could not do this without them. So much opportunity here, and I just appreciate everything that Greenlink's done for me. So thank you. Today's episode also, I just wanted to put this out there because we talk about some touchy issues here. Nothing on here represents the ideas or opinions of the sponsors. This is just Garry and I talking back and forth, having interesting conversations about the future and what we might be able to accomplish. So, all right, without any further messing around, let's dive into it. Here we go. I guess as a continuation of the last conversation that we had, I'll preface this one by saying if people are listening to this and they haven't listened to the previous one with you that we did it was like 4 or 5 episodes ago. They should maybe go back and listen to that, because that one, I think you did an incredible job of breaking down reconciliation, what that means, what that looks like, and then even breaking down, I think, explaining in context the Indigenous land ethic and how it differs from the Western land ethic, and why those two have been at odds for so long. So I think that episode was great for people to get into the right mindset for learning about a different type of management style and how we might be able to start to have these conversations, right? So I want to preface this one with saying people should listen to that one first if they haven't. But I suppose this will stand alone as well if need be, maybe a little more practical, maybe a little more example based. But I'm excited because we didn't get into that last time. That was the whole point of the last one, was to have some real concrete examples, and we didn't get a chance to. So, I wanted to start out just to kind of get us in the flow properly. And why do you think that Indigenous led management or Indigenous land ethics is important, and why would it help us in the situation we are in now? Obviously, for reconciliation, it would be a big help. But what about other values on the landscape or the rest of society? What does it have that's been missing up to this point?
Back in, I come at this a little bit sideways. Back in the early days of industrial forestry, the forester was the person who was out there walking with the birds and the animals and hanging out in the forest, and it wasn't the engineer. Mm-hmm. But over time, our foresters have become pretty much multi-purpose tools doing everything on the land base, and many are responsible for bringing logs in and supplying mills and keeping fiber flow going and that type of thing. And a lot of the profession is attached to that side of the industry or that side of forestry. And so what ends up happening is your orientation to forests really changes. And public, as foresters, our job is to translate public expectation into forests, and public expects a huge economic engine out of forests, or at least the political people do. And so that kind of thinking has entered our management, where we've started to see these things a bit like agriculture crops, like the forest as a whole. And it's true that you can manage some areas like that. You can manage them as plantations, but once you start moving to a large scale and start to convert a lot of your landscape to second growth managed forests, you start to lose a lot of the inherent functioning of the ecosystem. You start to lose biodiversity. You start to lose the richness and the interconnectedness on your ecosystem. Your hydrology starts to change. Your microclimates start to change. You lose, you start to lose, I'll call them ancient species, that many of those genetics might be really critical for us as we start building new forests that have to adapt to climate change and stuff. You lose the carbon that's stored in them. You lose many other ecosystem functions. I realize that's a bit of a tangent, but that's industrial forestry sees us as a commodity, and it's one commodity. We manage for timber subject to constraints, and that whole mentality drives our industry. The Indigenous communities, many of them, because of their earth-centered and earth-centric orientation, their earth-centered land ethic, are in a mode where you're part of nature, you're equal to everything in nature. You as a human being, your responsibility since the time you're born is to look after it properly. Mm-hmm. And so the orientation is very different. It's about taking care of the land and then taking what it gives to you after you take care of it, not the other orientation of what can it give to me and how do I try to minimize impacts to things that are important to other people while I do that.
Right.
Or how do I try to, And so from my perspective, we can see the effects of large-scale industrial forestry in British Columbia right now. We're starting to lose a lot of major mammal species, caribou, moose, and a number of others. We're starting to lose some of the smaller mammal species, badgers, etc. We're starting to lose many of the smaller species, goshawk, marble murrelet, spotted owls, etc. Now, some of that's due to climate change, but almost all of it, the impacts, particularly on the major species, is due to impacts of industrial forest harvesting at a mass scale, converting our entire timber harvesting land base to second growth managed forest. And that idea made sense when we first started it, because we were all about maximizing timber, and it wasn't until the last few decades that we really started to understand that this type of management has significant implications. Mm-hmm. The problem is we built the entire system on this notion of the single resource focus. So everything we do is structured to focus on that. Yeah. And for us to pull our minds back and pull our organizational infrastructure back to start to think of the forest and the land as a whole, to have that orientation and to build planning methodologies that reflect that and practices that reflect that is extremely difficult. We're very used to incrementally changing. We can't make major changes like that very easy at all. And so our every change we make in our forest management regime has been very tiny. We tried to do a major one 25, 30 years ago, and it was just too much all at once. Well, every government administration flips back and forth on what it thinks is important, and we went through a long period of that kind of thinking not being important. Now we're coming back into it again. And I think the Indigenous community, especially as it moves into partnerships under UNDRIP and DRIPA in British Columbia, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People Act, we're going to see that kind of management philosophy start to be injected into the way we look after our lands. The public wants it. We did an old growth review, and we heard from thousands of people that they want us to change. They want the way we manage our forests to change. They don't want to see this intensive style that compromises other values to continue any longer. But we need something to push it along. We need something to give us a light, a bit of a beacon, a way to get there. And the Indigenous models provide us some of that light.
Gotcha.
That's a long, that's a long answer, but that's, it's kind of a context thing too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, the context is crucial. And I've re-listened to the episode we did twice since I released it. So I've listened to it like 4 times because I've edited it and done everything else. And there's nothing in there that I ever wanted to remove or anything, regardless of whether or not you were off on a tangent on a side note. It was all contextual and all really good. So don't apologize. Your
at least it's been listened to 4 times.
Well, it's been listened to more than that. I can tell you that much. Yeah, no, it's doing well. The only one that I think I've gotten more hits on was the old growth one. That one's still, I think that's the highest listened to, or if not the second most highest listened to one I've had. But yeah, you're doing well. So I don't want to put you on the spot or anything like that, but I feel like there's probably some context needed for those that might be somewhat skeptical. What can you point to? Because you made a lot of statements about like loss of interconnectivity, loss of biodiversity, just loss of maybe a little bit of a loss of integrity, right, of the land management or of the land due to industrial forest management. What like resources can you point to, or what examples can you give that are like concrete examples to kind of hit that point home, so that it's not just, your say versus someone else. It's actually something concrete that you can point to and say, no, this is definitely what's going on, and this is why we need to. I'm trying to hit the point home of why there needs to be a mindset shift, Okay.
Well, we heard of numerous communities who had to basically upgrade and fix their water systems and deal with flooding. And their assertion is because there was of large-scale harvesting in their watersheds, and they never had the issue before the harvesting. Mm-hmm. I guess I would characterize that nobody's done the work to link cause and effect, and even if they did, it doesn't matter. The industry isn't responsible, so it ultimately ends up back in the local taxpayers because they don't get grants to fix that or anything anyways. We heard numerous examples of that, but I think maybe something a bit more specific might be the mountain caribou. Mountain caribou, half of our herds are extinct right now in British Columbia, and just by accident, those are where intensive forestry harvesting happens. Mm-hmm. If you ask a forester or an industrial forester, many of them will deny there's a link, but every biologist, every ecologist that I know who talks about this speaks about 2 issues, and then there is a climate change issue associated with this. Mm-hmm. But the first issue is numerous points of access going into the high country, which people use to access the high country. Winter is the big problem, but the deer and the other ungulates follow the openings in the browse, and they go up into the high country. And the predators follow them, and now we have a whole new set of predators living with these animals. And caribou really suck at looking after their young. They just have a baby and just kind of almost walk away. But they live in a relatively simple ecosystem. So that's the first part of the issue. Mm-hmm. Multiple access points that we maintain to get at the forests. And yes, there is a couple other, sometimes there's mining exploration, but most of the mining exploration now, at least in our area, the access is carefully managed and closed off. In fact, actually, a lot of it is done with bobcats and ATVs now. So it's very tiny. The second issue, though, and this is a really interesting one, we had one of the leading caribou experts talk to us about this one. He said they did a planning exercise, and the priority caribou habitat. Well, let's just flip back one step.
Sure.
The primary harvesting method that we use by far, it's about 90% 99 or 98%, at least here in British Columbia, is clear cut or clear cut with reserves, which is essentially a clear cut. And that harvesting system completely alters and sets the ecosystem back hundreds, if not thousands of years, the local ecosystem, because it just, that level of disturbance. And so it's completely altered, and the things that used to live in it before can't live in it for a very, very long time. In the case of caribou, you have to grow those trees up enough again to actually grow old man's beard or their food, their primary food, the lichen that grows on the trees, and especially for the wintertime. So they identified in this planning process, this caribou expert said, this herd here is essentially extinct. It just doesn't know it yet. We've only got a few animals left, and they're going to disappear because we set a critical caribou habitat management zone at this certain elevation band, and I think it was 7,500, but I can't remember. I really honestly can't remember the fine points.
Yep, that's okay.
And so industry came in and basically cut right up to that band. So, and particularly where they're doing mountain pine beetle salvage. So what you have is you have these mountains that are cleared right up to the elevation limit, and they look like little islands of trees in a mass clear cut. Well, the problem is, in a heavy snow year, the animals actually need about another 1,000 feet below that because they can't get around up in the heavy stuff. So sooner or later, and it's already happened once, you're going to get a heavy snow year and they're going to starve to death.
Yeah.
Moose. Let's pick on moose. Moose we're losing moose at an extinction rate in central British Columbia right now.
Really? Oh.
Yes. And it turns out that the quality of browse after a clear cut is significantly less in terms of nutritional value than the quality of browse after fire.
And
I
was unaware of that.
Yeah. And we have, this is research that just came out in the last few years. And we have done massive clear cuts. I mean, we used to be famous for our Bowron Lakes clear cut because you could see it from space. Well, these ones here are the size of most countries in Europe now, the one in the central interior. It's just mile after mile with these little knobs of trees on the tops of mountains and the odd little patch here and there.
So is that all because of mountain pine beetle reduction? Or was it just...
Yes and no.
Oh, okay.
Yes, there was a massive mountain pine beetle salvage program, but there was significant other volume taken out with that while it was going on. And so we now have these mass openings. And if you're a moose, you need a number of different, just like any animal at any scale. It's very rare that you have an animal that lives in one simple single habitat its entire life. It moves around between different things. Well,
especially
if you're a moose,
an 800-pound moose, right? Like
exactly, yeah. I mean, just even eating. But many of the bogs are dried up now. From the scale of there's no cover and retention, so all the moisture leaves the area very quickly. So first off, they got to find food. Secondly, moose, like many other animals, they don't just typically breed out in the middle of nowhere or anywhere, they have certain places they do that. Those places are gone. Once they have calves, they have places where they raise those. They don't have those anymore. They need places to stay in the winter. They don't have those anymore. So these animals now are struggling to find places to live on the landscape. Their food value is significantly less. And it turns out that there's a parasite that's endemic in moose. It lives in the gut of moose, that has now become, that is now killing them.
Huh.
Biologists, ecologists, I've talked to veterinarians, etc. They all say it's because they are emancipated and stressed.
Huh.
And they are just weak. And so now this endemic parasite has gotten, is turned into a pathogen.
Right.
And, but you talk to a forester, oh no, it's the parasite. Has nothing to do with the fact that they have to go 100 or 200 kilometers to find a bog to find something to eat or something like that.
And I would say in defense of that as well, because that's exactly where my brain was. Is I could see many like forestry folks getting sort of defensive, and I think regardless of why, whether it's because of climate change or because of directly because of forestry or because of whatever, it's happening, and we need to respond to that. Regardless of why, we need to respond. So we're kind of looking, like, to me, I look at these conversations with you as context and then where we need to go, not as a point of like blaming people for anything or anything like that. No. But it's looking to the future. It's like, hey, this is happening. We don't need to argue about why, but let's argue about how we can fix it. Like, let's talk about how we can fix it. That's how I see this, right?
That's how I see it too. No, exactly. Right. No, I'm not. We made choices as society, and now we're changing our choices because we're starting to understand the impacts of those choices. And I think, there's a lot of people who knew it before and said it, but you know what? We as a species, for some reason, seem to have to learn everything the hard way.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, here we are. We know cause and effect. Yeah. We may not know all of the cause and effect, but we know a vast majority of what the cause and effect is, and we have the ability to change that.
Yeah, so we definitely know contributing factors anyways, right?
Well,
at the very least.
The largest by far contributing factor, yes.
For sure, yeah.
And so we know how to fix it. We know how to manage to avoid this. Mm-hmm. But, so back to the Indigenous side, from an Indigenous community's perspective, I would struggle with seeing an Indigenous community letting that happen at that scale.
Sure.
If they were in charge, it just makes no sense at all. And sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm just pontificating here. Like, I was just thinking about what we talked about last time. We were talking about like the Western view, not just in management, but even in science or whatever, right? It tends to be an outcome-based perspective, right? And you had explained Indigenous view on like the Indigenous land ethic kind of thing as more of a value-based solution, by value-based system, right? So I was trying to figure out how to explain the difference between those two things, but it seems like we kind of need to start. We don't need to scrap everything, but we need to change the way we think about this, right? Like, I think you had said that in a previous episode as well.
Yes, it's definitely true. We need to shift our paradigm.
The paradigm shift. That's right.
The paradigm shift, and it's not easy to do that. Mm-hmm. I mentioned before, I understand you're in Alberta, and British mm-hmm. Columbia has a very deep industrial timber culture, mm-hmm. Very much like Alberta's oil and gas culture.
Yeah.
And it's deeply ingrained and deeply rooted in in society. And society is shifting. There's no question about that. But it's still deeply ingrained. It's not simple to just do these changes overnight. The paradigm shift that we're looking at now is certainly a paradigm. I guess at its highest scale, it's. I heard a quote on Yellowstone, that movie series. I thought it was great. Yeah, Kevin Costner was talking to this environmental lady, and he said our problems started when we stopped living with the earth and living on it.
Yep.
And in other words, we start to detach ourselves somehow. We don't live in it and on it anymore, or in it and with it, and that is maybe a consequence of the way we see the world, right? We now see the world as this thing, nature, like this thing over there, and if something happens, like for example, we don't depend on it in the same direct way as we used to. We have a grocery store. If something happens to, like if I'm a hunter-gatherer and something happens to me, I can just go to the store and buy some meat or buy some strawberries or whatever,
right.
As long as I got the money, or I can even, dig around in garbage and find enough to eat, or whatever. In this society, we have alternatives. You have to think about the day when you never had alternatives. If you screwed up, you died. Mm-hmm. Well, you have to have a very different and a much more personal relationship with land and that kind of culture, or many cultures have a culture where you learn to live with it, you learn to take care of it really carefully, and it's like a very one-on-one relationship. Right now, it's funny how long it took us to finally acknowledge that climate change was real, because we can pretend it's something over there, and
yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's just that
I do.
Just one step away from us. So yes, this at the highest level, that paradigm has to be that, but our paradigm flips now to more of a land stewardship and maintaining ecosystem integrity, maintaining the health of ecosystems, and taking what the land gives us versus looking at it as resources or timber, it's all about us getting at those resources and managing for the impacts, the constraints.
Yes.
But, and this is a big but, I think I mentioned this in a podcast before, we set a limit on what those constraints are. In British Columbia, you can manage for biodiversity, you can manage for wildlife, you can manage for visuals, you can manage for a whole bunch of things. But the cumulative impact of all of those things together, managing them has to be less than 10%, in some areas 6%, and in some areas 3%. So what that says is this is all about timber, and you can look after those things a certain amount, but you got to do them very sparingly, because this is about timber. Mm-hmm. And that thinking is pushing us into these corners in many places. So yes, the whole paradigm, and earth-centered societies and many of the indigenous societies have that inherently in them,
right? And
are building management systems from that center that express that on the land.
Absolutely.
So maybe it might be worth it to talk about a few of those kinds of approaches.
I was just going to say, let's dive into exactly that. Let's get into some examples, some ideas, because I think we've talked about a lot about the philosophy and kind of the mindset, right? I think we've covered that very well in the last episode and even the first little bit of this one. So yeah, let's get into some concrete examples. What does Indigenous forestry or Indigenous land management look like? Give us some examples.
Okay. There are literally thousands of these around the world. And I don't know everyone, so don't.
I didn't expect you to. It's okay.
No. I know lots, and right now I'm actually looking more and more. Two countries in particular, New Zealand and Australia, have really turned their whole land management system on its head, more along the lines of what we're speaking about right now. Mm-hmm. And the Indigenous community and their land ethic is a core part of the center of doing that. Very explicit public policy. And their whole approach has fundamentally kind of turned upside down, as we've described before in these. But let's pick something. I'll pick a couple from the U.S. to start with, and then we'll move to Canada.
Sure.
The Menominee is a really interesting model. It's over in Wisconsin. They've been managing their forest now under the guidance of an elders council for more than a century.
Okay.
It's a mixed hardwood forest, primarily with some some coniferous in it. Mm-hmm. And that forest has been maintaining its ecosystem integrity after a century of management. And basically what they use is over the whole forest is a low density continuous shelter wood. So very light, a lot like if you've ever heard of wildwood. Merv Wilkins on the island had a similar system, very tiny trails, one tree here, one tree there. And so their system has been that type of system for, like I said, more than a century now, under the guidance of their elders. Okay. The White Mountain Apache run a ski hill, commercial recreation, backcountry recreation, forest industry, primary and secondary manufacturing, forest products manufacturing, and have numerous endangered species measures over their whole land base. Mm-hmm. And they've been doing that now for I think it's been around 50 years, 60 years. Warm
that's
Spring.
Interesting.
Yeah, Warm Springs. And all of these things are thriving. So,
right.
And it's because you think about one to the next. First off, you think about the land and how to take care of it. Then you think about the impacts of one industry to the next, and you try to make sure that they all are synergistic and supporting each other.
Yeah.
And then Warm Springs has a really similar model. It's more of a zoning model, which I find interesting because we see a few of these zoning models in Indigenous approaches. Warm Springs has specific practices for specific zones throughout its territory. But one of the zones that I always found really interesting is they have a cinder cone in the middle of their land base. And this group is a cinder cone, yeah.
I don't know what that is.
A volcano. It's that, it's shaped like a cone.
Oh.
With a hole in the top.
Huh. Never heard that term before. Okay.
Oh, okay.
I don't know how, but
mounted Ziza.
Okay.
If you've ever seen pictures of that, there's many of them all over the world. Yeah, they look like they kind of look like a termite mound, except for at a mass scale. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So anyways, they have this cinder cone out in the middle of this big lava flat. And for them, it's a sacred space. And so they've drawn a ring. They've drawn basically 3 rings on this. The first ring, only healers and, the spiritual people, and those types of people and or people that they bring in for ceremony are allowed inside that ring. Then they have another ring that certain tribal people are allowed into for certain activities. And then they have another ring that is open but has restrictions. And then beyond that, there's none. And there's a lot of these kinds of zones on their landscape, which I find fascinating from a cultural perspective. And then the rest of their whole forest management, they've got this all laid out in manuals, is very much like the old BC Forest Practices Code, where they lay out quite rigid and stringent conditions on how their forests are managed on their land base to maintain ecosystem integrity. And they have a primary and a secondary forest products industry as well. And they have golf courses and hotels, and they control 1/3 of Oregon's economy. They have, they have hydroelectric facilities, etc. So, significant.
Well, yeah, and I think that's most people's aversion to Indigenous management styles. Is they think that it's going to be void of economic activity and it's just going to be a giant protection zone. And I think that's part of why we're here today too, is to dispel that myth and realize that no, the Indigenous folks are realizing that you need all of these activities in the land base. We just need to think about it more.
Well, but there is a small amount of truth in that. These right now in some areas, there's this one group that I've been providing some advice to, who has a regenerative plan. They're trying to regenerate the forests and the ecosystems because of the impacts of industrial forestry. It's a group on the coast, and they call their whole plan regenerative forestry. And they actually have shut down primary forests for now and are doing intensive regeneration activities on the other parts of the forest until they can get it healthy again at an ecosystem level. Then they'll start to manage at a larger scale, because in some places we're just back so far into that corner that you have to really do something pretty dramatic to get out of the situation. But if we were to make that choice as a society, that we thought that maintaining ecosystem integrity and health was important, we'd have to do the same thing. So they just are doing it because it's right for them. It's who they are.
Right.
And the level of detail that they've taken that down to restore grizzly corridors and restore ecosystem functioning, and that type of thing goes right down to very specific practices. The plan is very detailed on a site-specific level on how they're going to bring their whole territory back to bring back the integrity and the health of the ecosystems.
That's a challenging one to try and be given something that needs a lot of work and be like, here, good luck.
Well, I wouldn't say they're given it. I would say they're just taking it.
Yeah,
I think a lot of our people are getting just tired of asking for permission. They're just asserting their style, and they're getting so much support for it that it's very difficult for external parties to say no.
Right.
The Pachadat, the whole Fairy Creek thing have a similar plan, which is very different than the plan that is currently in place for that whole area. But it does still include an industrial forestry component, and it is still evolving as their understanding of how to do this grows. Their plan evolves with it. One of our issues that we have right now, which is I'm really struggling with, and I know how to fix it, and I just every one of us is building our land stewardship ability and methodologies right now, or not every one of us, but many of us are building this because we're moving into a world of collaborative management. In some places, we're exercising statutory decision-making through various arrangements with governments, or at a minimum sharing it. And so that means that we have to basically get ready on our own terms in most cases. Now, in some cases, there is a few isolated cases where the group is deep into the industrial side. They have not gone through the process of articulating their community's values, translating those values into stewardship methodologies, and they've largely adopted industrial models. I think those places, that's going to come back to bite them really hard when the community starts to see what other people are doing, and you're going to see a bit of a revolution in those places.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you will. I've seen it happen a few times before, and it will happen. But regardless, we're seeing at a mass scale this building of institutional infrastructure and planning methodologies, but there is no structured and systematic way for us to grow that knowledge base and to share it amongst each other. And so right now, myself and UBC, we're working on with Westbank, we're working on creating an Indigenous land center. Which its whole purpose is to gather and document Earth-centered land ethic, and document and describe how a community articulates that and approves it as its core and grounding philosophy, and document various stewardship approaches, planning approaches, and practices that are being used all over the country, and the associated institutional development that is happening with those in terms of management infrastructure, community engagement infrastructure, community education, etc., and teaching people how to do that, and supporting people to do that, building curriculum and sharing with other institutions, etc., to try to raise the bar here across the board as quickly as we can. We're in a period right now where we're going to flounder for a while until we can come up with really tangible, solid ways of stewardship planning and appropriate practices, come up with a proper agreed upon G to G way of doing that between the Indigenous governments and the provincial governments. We're floundering. And not only that, we also need, over and above that, take a step up. We need an Indigenous land governance framework, which focuses on logical ecological units and administrative units that are also tied to Indigenous territories, so that we can actually start to plan and manage at a big enough scale to make it proper. You know, one of the failings of land management, if you let it go too far, is the administrative planning fragmentation. If that gets too high, you suffer the death of 1,000 cuts because it's just too hard to coordinate it. Right now, the situation we have is in British Columbia is the province, and I would imagine the same thing in Alberta to some extent, but not as, it's a different context. But we have the provincial government maintains land stewardship relationships, government-to-government relationships with as many as 200 First Nations, and it has to act as a mediator, broker, facilitator between them on overlapping areas and for larger public policy initiatives. That's a system that's absolutely
that's a big
unsustainable.
Yeah.
That's unsustainable. Yeah. And so we have to rationalize that land governance framework. And so this is a project that is top of mind and high on the list as well.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, it sounds like that's kind of what's needed, right? I feel like it's like a lack of clarity. Like I think for people that are not in the Indigenous worldview, they're not really sure how to begin or how to help or how to, you know what I mean? They hear us talk about land ethics and ideas and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think you're right. Like getting something specific on paper that can be reviewed and looked at by these groups, it seems like a great way to get the ball rolling in the right direction for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Well, and this can be very practical.
Well, I think that's the society we live in, the Western society, right? Western society wants practical, pragmatic solutions. We struggle, I think, to have these philosophical conversations and then apply them to the real world, right? So it almost needs to be broken down into that way where you can say, okay, this is what you do to do this. This is what you do to accomplish this. And then all of a sudden Western society the system that Western society has created is able to pick those pieces up and utilize them. Otherwise, they don't, myself included, don't know where to start, right?
I'll give you two examples that are very similar, one from a stewardship planning level and one from a forest operations level.
Please,
Yeah. And again, I'm purposely not using names because I don't have their permission to do that. The stewardship planning example says you can do anything you want on this land base, providing you meet the constraints that are in place to ensure that the ecosystem integrity is maintained on this landscape. So a couple of the parameters are, one of them is that we need to retain at least 50% of every old growth ecosystem type. We need to maintain at least 50% of its historical distribution at any given time on the landscape. And that whatever we leave needs to be big enough that it can function properly as a unit, and it needs to be connected to other things. So we're trying to keep the whole landscape, the integrity of the landscape. But you can go into those areas and you can take things out in a percentage of them. The thinking now is about 50-60% of them, but you have to maintain the structural attributes, the old growth structural attributes when you go in. So in other words, that means, again, single tree selection or continuous shelterwood type system, and very low density. So you can move these around, but you have to keep some of it in a forest state and some of it in an attribute state, the old growth, some in an undisturbed forest state, some in an maintaining the attributes. And that can change over time. If you go in and take out, you do a treatment in an area, you've maintained the structural attributes. If you leave it for 40 or 50 years, it'll recover and grow back. Then you can keep that as a forest and go somewhere else and do, some light touch stuff, and you can move these around on the landscape. So that's the broad thinking of the planning process, and therefore they own the license, the timber license, and the timber license has been given the instructions, you need to follow this, and they're laying it out on the ground now. Another one, though, is a community I know who owns a large-scale area-based forest tenure. And this area has been incredibly contentious for a long time because the forest operations have been affecting the municipal water systems and causing all kinds of grief for the locals. And so now the First Nation has a tenure and they started building their forest management plan with their elders. And they have now built what basically a total chance plan for their area. Again, same parameter. You have to maintain at least half of the area in old growth state, and you can intensively manage the other half, but you have to manage it in a way that does provide some connectivity and maintains soil values, maintains hydrological cycles, etc. So trying to use NDT appropriate, natural disturbance type appropriate silviculture systems, etc. They've
Gotcha.
laid this out on their land base, and their initial calculations tell them that their AAC is going to be higher than if they had done a traditional clear the area and leave it in this area, and all of the local residents. And this is a population of many thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, are all like right on. Thank you. And they want to see this done everywhere in this region. So,
well, and not just to say that, but like if you do it this intensively managed, or not intensively managed, but this well planned out, and your AAC goes up, so you're cutting more. There's more economic activity, but the extra planning, I gotta imagine, is creating new jobs and creating more economic incentive than even before, probably, right? Like it just seems like all of the right things are happening, right?
Yeah, it feels like it. Yeah. Well, and you got more people spending time on the land. It's very similar to what we're trying to move towards in British Columbia now, managing for ecosystem integrity and ecosystem health is that requires us to use natural disturbance type NDT appropriate silviculture systems at a mass scale.
Yeah.
What I mean by that, for if you have people who aren't foresters, is every area of land has these inherent disturbances that nature will do. And we classify those here, and most places have their own classification system. And ours, NDT1, means rare stand replacing events. So that would be typically temperate forests, the interior temperate rainforest or the coastal rainforest, where you get, the trees fall over, you get the odd blowdown event, but it's mostly just a kind of falling in on itself and continually regrowing type thing. And then you go all the way over to, say, NDT3, that's frequent stand replacing events. So that would be typical of the boreal ecosystem, where we see fire continually burning large areas. NDT4, that's a fire-maintained ecosystem. So that's like the California redwoods or a lot of the central interior in BC, where the understory is relatively clean because fire goes through there all the time and keeps the understory down. And then you end up with these big trees with thick bark that can withstand these fires. Well, when you're going in to harvest these, when I say NDT appropriate, you use a silviculture system that tries as much as possible to mimic what nature would have done there and leave the area in a very similar state as to what nature would have left it in using its own inherent disturbance patterns or natural disturbance types. And so if you do this at a large scale on a landscape, what you are doing is preserving the integrity of the ecosystems at a local level and at a landscape level, as long as you leave it all connected to each other and you're still taking things. That type of work requires a bit more planning. There's no question about it, but it definitely requires a little more skill and more labor intensity in the actual taking out of the trees, of the timber, and so ends up, frankly, creating more jobs. But, if you want the quickest, cheapest is just to mow it down one end to the other. And that's what we're doing in many cases. But the problem with that is we've gotten so good at mowing it down. Our AAC hasn't changed for 10 years, but our jobs per cubic meter has gone down to half of what it was 10 years ago.
Right.
And that's because we're just getting to be experts at this intensive clearing style of harvesting.
And that's the capitalist incentive as well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's always to get more profit and make it cheaper, create efficiencies, all that. But it feels like we're starting to recognize that it's that situation is detrimental when you're talking about something like land management, because exactly. You start to degrade and you're not you start to deplete rather than maintain or rebuild. So
if you let it go too far, but I mean, we of course need to be very conscious of cost and efficiency, and even using these other systems, we can still be as efficient and cost effective as possible. Of course we can, and we can get better at those too. But inherently, they just require more effort, and so will require more labor. So, in order to maintain competitive industry, we need to start to deal with the stumpage and rent and royalty side, so that people can actually afford to do this. The Crown makes less money, but direct money. But it makes as much or more. And every piece of economic analysis I've seen on this always tells us we make more from the higher number of people employed, the larger number of equipment that has to be used, all of the other supporting secondary things. The multipliers go up. When I say multipliers, when you put $1 into something, the question is how many dollars does that $1 of direct investment or cost translate into in the larger society? How many other dollars does it generate? And the multiplier goes up with these kinds of systems. So overall, government ends up and society ends up making more return off these because of the other industries that can continue to prosper, because of the higher labor that's involved, because of the higher capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the lowering of costs to address the impacts of the other system. So all of that together adds up to much greater returns to society and government.
And that parallel is something I've read recently, and I'm probably going to misremember this, so maybe it's not helpful, but it was talking about economic activity and how we measure economic success, right? And a lot of economists apparently will say that measuring gross domestic product isn't a good measure of how well off a society is doing, right? All it does is measure how busy an economy is, how much is changing hands. It doesn't take into account any of the additional values, such as how well off people are doing, how many people have jobs, what the rate of the standard of living is, what the I'm trying to remember exactly how they explained it so delicately, and I don't remember how they did it. But anyways, basically they're saying that even economists say that GDP is not a good measure of that. And so we need to start measuring our success of our economy more robustly, to include values that actually impact every citizen, right? So, this kind of a system seems to make sense in starting to accomplish a more robust economy, not just one that is valued on how much profit we get, but how well is everybody doing? Those are different measures.
In the Indigenous community now, many of us are working on building our economies and dealing with some of our chronic social issues. And I'll give you an example, let me just talk from maybe a slightly more theoretical or higher level to start with. The issue with this is that we're focused on outputs. A GDP model is an input-output model, as opposed to focusing on outcomes.
Oh, okay.
And so I'll give you a very concrete example in housing in the Indigenous community. We have a number of structural problems and so it's caused a real housing crisis in our communities. And it's a structural problem with federal land ownership and a whole bunch of other factors mixed in that has created this. And so we have to address this. And a lot of people just focus, okay, on how many houses did you build? Well, you can build 1,000 houses in one community and maybe make that community worse, and build 10 houses in another community and fundamentally change its quality of life. The reason is because there's so many other factors that are at play here: the governance, the dependency mindset, the understanding of how to look after houses, the cultural and the way that people live with their houses, etc., and how they live in them is critical, and style, and the nature of their family and their gathering. All this stuff needs to be thought through, and so you start to think about outcomes. Well, now I start to think about, okay, quality of life outcomes, shifting of community values. And so now I have to start thinking about things like governance, and what kind of a governance system do I have? What kind of a social supports do I have in place to help these folks who haven't had houses forever now have houses, and they have all these other things that they need to work through? What are those, and what are those in place? What kind of other things do I have to cultural supports, so that I can start to rebuild culture back in for if this population, depending on where it's at. And all of these things, so then you start to work on all these things along with your housing, and now all of a sudden only building a few houses is starting to make a difference in those communities, because you're dealing with all the other things. You're focusing on societal outcomes. A friend of mine says, I like to try to measure the twinkle in a child's eye. And I think that's a really perfect analogy. And it's the same with land management. We focus on these bits. Einstein has a saying that I love. He says, characteristic of our times is this confusion between means and ends. And that is very true. And so you're right. I'm glad to hear that economists are thinking like this. I used to work in economics for a while, timber supply and economic analysis, and there were a few economists who were starting to think like this, but many, were still in the kind of numbers business. But well, it's the quality.
It's the classic example, to make it real simple. It's just the quality versus quantity thing, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like just people understand that, and that's basically with using only a GDP as a measure of success, or a measure of measurement for economic success. You're basically just determining quantity, and there's no qualitative aspect to it. And so we need to change that as well, right? So it's interesting. Yeah, it's going back to the forestry thing a little bit. I was going through some of the stuff you sent me, and you sent me the use of traditional knowledge review process, or review of the presence of use of traditional knowledge for the Yukon.
Yes.
I think it was. And that was just recently, like last January. And I was reading through it, and to summarize it extremely, it seemed to me like basically the difference was, compared to current forestry practices, was that we have the plan in current forestry practices, but in the Yukon version, the plan was missing key perspectives. And secondarily, consultation was happening, but it was not happening meaningfully. And as a result of missing perspectives and lack of meaningful consultation, the actions that were being done were not appropriate, right? So it wasn't like the plan wasn't happening or whatever, and based off the information they had, they were doing the right thing, but it wasn't being done comprehensively enough to understand that what the actions are inappropriate, right? So it seemed to narrow it all down, it seems like it's just planning and consultation and more meaningful conversations that are actually going places rather than, and doing it ahead of time, right?
Yes, that particular piece that I sent you, Gillian McKee compiled the effectiveness of Indigenous engagement in the development and implementation of 9 different land use plans. It was a case study. Mm-hmm. And she found in her work that the plans that were the most effective, mm-hmm. First off, respected Indigenous knowledge, and did that in a very, not just a kind of saying it way, but in a real way. It actually
not the checkbox way.
No, it's
right?
not the checkbox way. It's actually collecting it, building it right into the entire planning process, and making sure that it's used properly. And a lot
not
of
just doing what the government says you have to do, right? Going above and beyond to actually live this reality and not just do the minimum. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I don't know about you, but I know when I went to school, the notion of Indigenous knowledge was always kind of like second-class knowledge. It was, kind of hokey, whatever. And I can give you
it was definitely considered like a we'll give them the time of day.
Yeah, it wasn't. It's not real. It's not worth anything. Well, I can give you numerous examples of Indigenous knowledge where it has turned out to be way more valuable than scientific knowledge. And this is not a competition. This is using all of the best knowledge that you can get to produce the best plan you can produce. The thing is I think I mentioned this to you last time, you've got a people who've lived in an area for thousands of years, who've lived off of this area and need to understand it really well so that it can continue to, so that they can take care of it, so that it can continue to take care of them. If you live like that, you're going to learn something about that area. That's just as simple as that. And not just something. You're going to learn things like time series things that you really have a very difficult time understanding as a scientist coming in and doing a few quick research studies. There's so many things that you just, you got to think about how big and complex this land base is, and the odds of you stumbling on this pattern or this thing that you would have to the local history to know is small. And when you multiply those out, there's thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of those kinds of things on any given landscape. Well, a lot of that stuff exists in the minds of the local people, depending on how closely they're attached to that land base. So learning how to map that, learning how to document it, learning how to integrate it into planning is a key factor of success.
Absolutely.
The other thing is that many Indigenous communities have not gone through building their stewardship planning methodologies. Knowing land and knowing how to build a stewardship or land use plan or whatever you want to call them they're two very different things, but building a plan to look after it is a very technical exercise. There's a whole bunch of work involved in that. And so often they'll hire outside experts or work with government to help them do that. And these people know a certain way of doing it. And it's not a way that works well with the community. And so these plans end up being, in many cases, built using external methodologies that are very poor at engaging and educating community and don't properly understand and collect local knowledge and don't properly reflect it in the plans and don't implement the plans in a way that's grounded in the community. And it's not I won't characterize it as a fault of anybody because there's requirement for joint plans in many of these areas. I'd characterize it more as almost like ships passing in the night. One group's thinking like this, and the other group thinks like this, and they think they're working on something similar, but they're not. They're quite different. And the plans that we the plans that we see that are most effective are very deeply grounded in local knowledge and very. One fellow was telling me recently I held a series of workshops with a bunch of land stewardship planning experts, including a bunch of Indigenous planners. And one of the fellows was telling me that he had his plan. The terms of reference for the plan were approved by the community before they even started it through a community vote. And then the whole thing was grounded in, they reported to the community all the time. And then when it was done, the final plan was approved by the community. That plan now, he calls it a relationship plan. It's what is our relationship to the earth and the land, and what is the land's relationships to each other, and how do we maintain and foster those and keep all of those healthy and still use it. That's the whole orientation of the plan. And I thought that was quite brilliant because it just sets a proper mind frame, in my opinion.
No, it totally makes sense. And something you said, you're talking about ships passing in the night. And it seems like, like the Western scientific perspective is very much that 10,000 foot view of like, oh, this kind of forest is like this, and this kind of forest is like this. And it's good knowledge. It's not, it's very necessary, but you're right. It doesn't have the local specificity to really be able to be applied just kind of wholesale across a giant area and have everything be okay. So it's like the Western forest management has been this very scientific approach of very just kind of, we have the academic knowledge, not really much local in there, but we have the academic general idea of how these forests succeed and how they do well and how they thrive. And we're just going to apply that and hope it's all good. But talking to, for example, I spoke with George Bresco from the Wells Gray Community Forest, and he was talking about how they do their stuff, right? And this idea of having the local management and having all of the stakeholders involved daily, all the time, and bringing people out to talk about what's going on and how their values are being managed for and being protected, as well as creating goods and services for the community and then reinvestment back into the community to increase school and that kind of stuff, or services for school and that sort of thing. And it seems like that's the big piece missing, is just that local knowledge, that local management perspective. Like, I really appreciated talking to George about that, and get the community forest approach seems overwhelmingly better for the community and for that local ecosystem than the industrial approach, for sure. And I feel like I feel like though, even though it's not Indigenous, specifically Indigenous led in Wells Gray, I feel like it's akin to that type of management system. Like, obviously there's not the heritage, the culture, traditional plant stuff, and there's not the deep cultural perspective, but I feel like it is a more holistic management style that goes well with what we're talking about today.
I think we should probably just deal with a bit of a misconception here.
Sure.
That somehow earth-based or earth-centered is uniquely Indigenous, and all Indigenous groups have it. And both of those are not correct.
Gotcha.
Earth-centered means that you put the earth at the center of your being and your relationship to land and in life, and your whole survival focuses on how do I maintain and build a stronger relationship to earth and take care of it better. It becomes essentially a religious pursuit, I'll call it, very much like, other religions have God at their center. or whatever. Every religion has different things. Well, these are earth-centered. Now, what is true is that many, if not most, Indigenous communities are earth-centered, and they have developed a discipline over many thousands of years of being that. So they've learned some things just because of the fact that that's who they're all about. But that doesn't mean that others can't decide to take this path and learn lots. And it doesn't mean that every Indigenous community was or is that. Some Indigenous communities were takers. And we have evidence of Indigenous communities that kind of grew and exploded and died because they lived way beyond their means, and they couldn't get their strawberries and lettuce from California. They could only go as far as they could send slaves to get them, and eventually they collapsed. The Mayans are one example, but there's many examples of these types of societies. Very monetary, very taking-oriented societies. So earth-centered doesn't mean you might think a society is earth-centered because it looks like they're worshiping earth, but worshiping symbols and being something is not the same thing. If you appreciate it. It's the same with any other kind of religion. You might be worshiping the symbols, but you're not living true to the heart and principles of it. And you see that a lot in Muslims and Christianity and stuff, where you see lots of people worshiping the symbols and losing the root of what the religion was actually all about in the beginning, the humanity of it. And many other, and many other religions, very similar. So I know that's a bit of a philosophical discussion, but it's important to understand that the likelihood of you being earth-centered increases significantly when you understand that your survival is completely dependent on taking care of the earth.
Yeah.
And so what is true is that many Indigenous societies ended up being earth-centered because, as I said, you didn't have an alternative. You didn't have a grocery store. So they ended up being that. But they also...
You had no choice.
But they also... These societies tend to be very, very pragmatic in nature. And so it's logical. Well, let's just put it this way. First off, man is an animal. Just like any other animal, man is not more than or less than any other animal. I mean, we like to think we are because that's part of how we gain comfort in our fear of being infinitely small in a place we know nothing about. But we once you accept that and you surrender to that and you say, okay, it's a good thing for me to actually try to build my whole being and discipline around that understanding that I am equal to everything and that I need to learn to live with it because it keeps me healthy. And if I'm doing it right, it's keeping all of my brothers and sisters and relatives of different forms healthy too. And so when you start to think of your family as this extended family of all the living beings around you, then you start to act like that. You start to treat it like that, and you start to build a whole discipline and ceremony and symbiology around that. And as long as you keep your mind on that and focus on that and continue to learn and grow in it, then you become very deeply earth-centered over time. There are numerous other societies. There's a whole set of religions, even modern religions, that are very much earth-centered religions that are working hard to do this. And they're not all, of course not, they're not all Indigenous. They're people who have made that leap and who have chosen to make this their center.
Yeah.
It's not a big difference than anything else. We have a saying, and in many of our cultures, is that the Creator made everything in infinite forms to all live together, including religions. Mm-hmm. And so everything from the Creator is good.
Yeah.
And so this is not about bad or right or wrong or whatever. It's about what is. It just simply is what it is. And some things are like this and some things are like that. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way the world is built.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is just about trying to live more harmoniously, trying to take everything into account and just, yeah.
It's a big leap for us as a society.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And that's why for me, I'm a very strong supporter of how these earth-centered religions and ethics and ideologies are translating into land stewardship systems, because many of them are incredibly pragmatic. They're very economically effective, especially when you start considering the larger economics as we spoke about. And they take care of the land infinitely better than our other way of thinking and approaching, which is, So I have a real deep bias towards land and towards community and community wisdom, and fostering both of those. So it's just who I am.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've become deeply fascinated with these concepts as well. And this is something that's not really related, but I guess it ties in well to what you were saying. It's something I'm excited to parrot. I was listening recently to the philosopher Alan Watts. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He brought in some Taoist philosophies over. He's an English guy who brought these philosophies over from Asia and kind of made them popular. And I was listening to something he said the other day, and he was talking about the Western societies, our obsession with wealth, right? And the idea of wealth, and we tie our success and happiness directly, or at least we conceptually tie our success and how happy we're going to be based on how much wealth we have. Yet he points out that most of us don't actually have wealth. We're obsessed with the tokens of wealth, right? Money is just this thing that we've decided is worth something, and it's not really wealth unless you spend it, right? And so I think the idea of having an earth-based culture or earth-based ideals like that, it's so much more real and pragmatic and something tangible than these being obsessed with the collections of these tokens of wealth in order to be happy or successful or whatever, right? So I like that. I think people can relate to it a lot easier, right?
Yeah. No, I'm as we speak, I'm Googling this fellow. I like some of his sayings here. Yeah. I really like that. Yeah. Muddy water.
Yeah, Alan Watts is incredible.
Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's funny, those philosophers, they really know how to spin the words to get a visual in your head and just make things clear, right?
Yeah, I
love it.
Yeah, no, I like great. That too. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah. I do have a question regarding something that's come up in the Good Fire series that I help produce. That I've heard from non-Indigenous people listening to the Good Fire series. So the Good Fire series, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but we're talking about cultural burning across the globe with Indigenous folks, right?
Yes.
And Amy Christensen is the lead on that. It's her podcast. I just help her out with it. But something that people have said to me was that, it's all well and good, but they get the impression that that there's this idea or this romanticism around Indigenous management that they feel as if it's infallible. The way they do it is infallible, and it's prone, it can't make mistakes, and it's going to be whatever. You know what I'm saying? It's infallible. And my response to that was like, no, I don't think that's what they're saying. It's what they're saying is that this is a way of working that we haven't tried at this scale before. And it seems to be much more comprehensive and include more values and include more of reality rather than what we've been doing up until now. And that this is something that is worth, and I think most people that are paying attention will realize that it seems like it's going to be a better way of thinking about this, right? And so I want to know what you thought about that idea of infallibility and maybe, because I'm sure that's an argument you've come across from people before. Is that so? What's your response to that?
Well, first off, let's look at the very positive side of that. Is that all of us, or many of us, are striving to look for better ways to have our cake and eat it too, right? And one of the things is, how do we look after land better, in a better way? Because I think intuitively, my gut tells me that all of us understand that if we don't, it will come back to bite us. If you don't look after the land, it won't look after you, and vice versa. If you do, it will. Yeah. And even, maybe you won't see it this minute, but you will see it at a larger scale. It will come back. Climate change is, again, a good example of that. You don't quite see it every day, but it's happening, it's real, and it's because of the way we live, the impacts of the way we live. So land is meant to be used. The question is how do you use it? And we're all struggling with that. We all have our ability to deny our impacts to some level. But as you move to this other style of management, I'll call it earth-centered management, that's characteristic amongst many Indigenous communities, that doesn't mean that you're not going to make mistakes. I mean, the land is an incredibly complex organism that has so many permutations that you will never, ever understand. And then it has all of this, I'll call it, natural range of variability, and things that happen that are way outside of that occasionally. Like stuff happens that you could have never anticipated, or when you try a certain thing at a big scale, like, for example, this notion that we convert all of our timber harvesting land base to second growth managed forests. We thought that was a great idea until we did it to a scale where we realized, holy, this is having some impacts that we didn't really understand the consequences of those impacts. In terms of maintaining ecosystem integrity and health, and so the difference is, I think we have the word, what is that? When you manage something carefully, so that if you make a mistake, it's not a major mistake. My brain is kind of stopping on me now, but I can't
think of it either.
Yeah, it's a style of management. It's using, it's the precautionary principle. Okay. In other words, I don't know for sure, so I'm going to be precautionary. So if I make a mistake, it's not going to be a catastrophic mistake. Well, that type of thinking is built into most earth-centered management approaches. It's built right in. But not every group is all the way there. Some groups might be young at it, and they may not have developed all the aspects of the thinking yet. They'll tend to make more mistakes. Even people who've been around for a long time tend to make the odd mistake, because it's one thing. It's one thing to live with the earth and live in balance with it when you're doing it at a smaller scale. If you don't take 2 sticks, if you only need 1, you just take 1. And that type of thinking, that whole thinking underneath that, it's you live with. taking only what you need.
Yeah.
But once you start scaling that up to a large scale, you start to get impacts that you couldn't, you maybe had a clue that they might happen, but a lot of them kind of surprise you and you go, oh, okay. If I'm paying attention though, and I'm watching carefully and I'm maintaining my earth center, I'll adjust my management and I'll grow. I will use a lot of adaptive management type techniques and styles to grow and learn. Are they infallible? Nothing is infallible.
Of course.
Nothing. The whole notion of certainty and predictability and reliability in nature is an illusion. Nature is not like that. Nature just is what it is. If you think you can make it like that, then you're dooming yourself to a life of frustration.
Especially in the time of climate change, right? Like it's like good luck.
The best you can do is build resilience, if anything, into your landscape so that it can adjust to bigger and more widespread change. Anyways.
Yeah, for sure.
So anyways, I
like
think
that a lot.
Yeah, but I do understand that some people might say that because there is a whole crowd out there, and I have to acknowledge this too, who kind of use, I'll call it Indigenous land management, as a bit of a weapon and say it's better than anything. And, they're purposely dismissive and purposely overbuilding it and all the rest of that. And saying that it's perfect or implying that it's perfect and et cetera, et cetera. And so maybe that does get people's backs up. And
people
I
feel
guess
attacked,
we have to,
right?
Yeah, I guess we have to kind of acknowledge that. But, everybody has their own style, I guess, on promoting things. And so maybe that's the way some people do it. I find that some of those people who are doing that, when you tend to overinflate things, it usually points to a lack of confidence. Because you feel like you need to oversell or overinflate to make it seem bigger than it is, to build yourself up.
Yeah, what was the thing you said last time? You said something about the quality of their convictions.
Gandhi.
Gandhi. Yeah.
Intolerance betrays a lack of faith in one's cause.
Yes. That's what it was.
Right. That is quite profound when you think it through. And
that's an interesting one.
Yeah, it just makes you go, oh my God. Yeah, it kind of, if you think it through, it just eats at your soul a little bit, because you look at yourself and go, okay, why am I so flippant intolerant and I can't hear and I can't? Well, it's because I'm just absolutely terrified, and I'm not grounded very well often in what I'm doing. Yeah. So I'm just using weak arguments to fight. A friend of mine, he's an author, Chris Mazer. He has this saying, and I love it, because he was on an industry panel once. This was in forestry. And he said I understand that we all need to grow and work through this. And he says, and I was on this industry panel, and they were just losing it and coming up with every possible argument and way of doing this, and almost making things up and conjecture and fear mongering and all of the things they needed. And he said, I just watched them beating their drums of fear and felt like, how can I help them grow beyond that? And I thought it was a perfect analogy, because I've seen that so many times in so many sectors, and I totally get the fear. You've got all of these people who depend on you, their livelihoods, their families. Often you're close to them. You care about them. You've got shareholders. You've got billions of dollars in capital. You've got all this stuff, and all you've got in front of you is somebody talking what sounds like nonsensical idealism, and you have no idea how to translate that into reality, even if you might believe in the underlying philosophy. And so that, and you get really scared that if I don't deal with this quickly, this is going to turn into something that's going to undermine me completely and end up killing me. And I totally get that. I totally get that fear.
Yeah.
And the only way through that is help build a new change in thinking, build some practical transition measures and practical ways of doing it that reflects this new way of thinking, and work with those folks who are doing it because they know best on how they can change, and they have incredibly useful input and advice in the process. Anything in life that's worthwhile, you always have to dance with the devil. That's the way it is if you're going to achieve worthwhile things. Yeah,
absolutely. I love that.
I've seen the degradation of our social license on the forestry side, particularly our industrial forestry side, in so many places, and seen these types of things help bring that back.
Yeah,
people just can only stand to feel like they're being marginalized and watch their lands around them from their perspective being compromised completely, and having major impacts on them, and in so many financial and cultural ways, and I guess spiritual ways. People can only stand that for so long, and then they just get tired of it and say, that's enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
I think even in the professional world now, in the forestry world, like you said, I think it's becoming more and more standard conversation. And I think it's about how do we transition with minimal casualties to the environment and to economy. And I feel like that's what's holding it up, is like, how do we make this transition in a way that it doesn't fall apart. Right. I think that seems like what the holdup is at this point.
That is the challenge right now. That how do we get from the here to there? And it's compounded by the fact that we don't know what the there looks like yet. And that's really unsettling for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, because you don't have a clear vision of what that place is that we're actually going to. And so it just eats us alive. And again, as I said, you've got thousands of families potentially and billions of dollars and all kinds of other things invested in this. It's not like you can just flip a switch, and it just creates a lot of anxiety and uncertainty in those folks as well, and all of the people who depend on them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's got to be done in a way that it maintains, it doesn't create more harm while transitioning into a system of more good.
Yeah. I personally, Al and I, when we did the old growth review, one of the principles that we wrote into this was, because it is a major transition for us in the forest sector here in British Columbia, was that this needed to engage all of the relevant parties, all of the people who have a deep vested interest and who can contribute to this wisdom in the process. That's, in my mind, having worked through a number of major changes, the best way to do it is to educate everybody so that they all have a good knowledge base to work from and bring the best of the latest of the scientists. Make sure that you have all the people in a room, foster a covenant amongst those people, and be clear on this is the outcomes that we're looking for, and then work with everybody to figure out how do we achieve those outcomes. And in my experience, that ends up producing the best transition results. It doesn't mean that some things don't change, and it doesn't mean that there aren't casualties, because in any positive change. There's always going to be casualties.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Garry, once again, I think we've managed to hit some topics on the head here and get some clarity from you on how this can be accomplished and what it kind of looks like. So I appreciate you taking the time once again to do this. Love picking your brain. It's always enjoyable.
Okay, well, thank you, Matt. It's been a slice again. Yeah, always interesting.
Thanks a lot for listening, folks. It was awesome, right? Garry's the best. Thank you, Garry, for all of your knowledge, all of your stories, all of your context. It is so appreciated, and I know everyone's learning so much whenever they listen to you. So thank you for everything. Yeah, and that's it. If you guys have any questions for myself, for Garry, for whatever, shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I'll get back to you. Make sure to rate, review, and share. Get it out there. I appreciate it. This is all about building the future of forest management, and I'm excited to see where we go with it. So, yeah, thanks for joining the conversation. I hope you come back next time. Take care.